In this video, I'll show how you can make a local cooperative game using the new input system and Unity visual scripting. Let's begin.
Shall we play a game?
Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Megahertz, and I am back from a couple-month-long hiatus, and boy, do I have something cool to show you. Today, we're going to use the new Unity input system along with the visual scripting add-on and hopefully get a couch co-op game to work with just about any game device that you'd like to use. Before we begin, I probably should drop a few disclaimers though. First of all, it probably should be said that I am using the 2021.1.26F1 version of this. This does not have the long-term support. This is the best or the newest install official release that you can get as of today, which is 10/24/21. And yeah, so this is, I have tested this. If you are going to use an older version of Unity, then you will have to add the Bolt visual scripting add-on. It is moving to be called the Unity visual scripting, which I don't know, it's just taken me some time to get used to that, but this is the build that we are actually going to be using for that. I should also probably note that I am using the pixel art top-down basic pack that you can get off the Unity Asset Store. If you want to follow along, I would recommend that you get this build. It's free. All it has is a little cat-like figure that looks like it's, you know, it moves around and stuff. You can push boxes and go around the map, but this is what I used, and I'd highly encourage you to get this. It's free. It's got some cool assets, and you can see how a multi-layered top-down RPG can actually be built. So that's really cool. So go ahead and add that to your assets. Of course, if you're going to have an account with Unity to do this, but what are you doing on this tutorial if you don't have an account with Unity? I mean, really, you're using Unity. How did you get Unity without an account? And as stated earlier, we are going to be using the Unity input system to accomplish this. I'll show you how to get all that installed. You are going to need a couple of inputs, though, maybe an Xbox controller or a PlayStation controller, whatever you have. You can use a keyboard and mouse if you want. I'm going to be using two Xbox controllers for the purpose of this build, but it should be universal across the board. One last thing, I know this is a visual scripting tutorial, and this is all about what my channel is all about, and this isn't necessarily true to visual scripting. You are going to need one C# script, and listen, I know that might put you off a little bit, but I mean, dude, if you look at this, this is all that there is to it. I've squeezed it down to this. The reason being that there is a component that you need to have access to that you just can't get with visual scripting. They have not implemented that just yet. And so if you don't want to write this code as we get to it, you can actually go to my online blog and download it. I'll try to put the link in the description as well, and you can just import it into your game if you want. It's really not that big a deal. It'd probably be faster to write it, and maybe you learn something as you get involved with it. But with all that being said, let's get started with this build. Okay, for this build, you are going to need to start a new Unity project. We're going to do this completely from scratch. Just go to New and add a 2021.1.26 or whatever 2021 version you have. It should be just fine. The reason we're using a 2021 is, again, because you have access to Unity visual scripting without having to install Bolt. I'm just going to call this Couch Co-op. There you go, Couch Co-op. Go ahead and create that, and that's my beautiful wife. And as it continues to load here, we'll pick it up once it's done. Good Lord, that took forever. Okay, now we are going to go to Window, and we're going to go to our package manager, and we're going to install the Unity input system. The way that you do that is you're going to, as soon as it's done here, come on, there we go. Okay, so go to Packages, go to Unity Registry, and scroll down until you see the input system right here, and then you're just going to hit install. And once it's done taking its sweet time, you should see a warning that, let's be honest, you're probably not going to read. For all you know, it could say, let's obliterate the earth. Would you like to do that? Yes. Okay, so what this is basically doing is it's saying that it wants to switch from the old input system to the new input system, and when you hit yes, it is going to close down Unity, and it is going to restart it using the input system. So I know this is a very lengthy process, but once it's all done, you should be good to go. And once you're done with that, you should be able to go to Packages, My Assets, and find the Pixel Art Top-Down Basic pack. If you don't see this, it's because you didn't add it to your account at the Unity Asset Store. So go back to the Unity Asset Store, find the Pixel Art Top-Down Basic, log in, add it to your account, and then it should show up under your assets. We're going to go ahead and import this into our game. This will take just a second. And when we import it, we are going to import everything that it has. We're not going to be using just about everything, but, I would recommend getting it just for the fact that you can look at how he has his project set up, which I think is really well done. So, yeah. And we're just about ready to go and make some changes. You'll probably notice that my windows are set up a certain way. This is just the way I like. I got my hierarchy over here, my project, and two folder view right there, console and inspector. I've got my animator, animation, and if you don't see the visual scripting graph, then what you're going to need to do is go up here to Window, scroll down to Visual Scripting, and then hit Visual Scripting Graph. The first time you do this, you probably should see this analyzing code base, and it's going to go through this little lengthy process. But then you should have the tab pop up, and all I did is drag it right here to the middle. Okay, and when that is done, you're going to go to Kanos folder that he's got right here, and go to Pixel Art Top Down, go to Scene, and just hit this SC Pixel Art Top Down Basic, and you should pop up with a scene that looks just like this. It's got a little player, and if you wanted to, you could go ahead and play it as it is with C#, but we are actually going to make several changes to this because we're not using C#. For the most part, we are using visual scripting. So let's first of all click on the player and right click it and go to where does it say prefab and unpack it. We are not going to want to make any changes to the prefab that we have. Go ahead and take off the PF, just name it player. We're going to take off this top down character controller. You are not going to need that, so you can just remove that component. And we are going to have to add a script machine. And we are also going to add a variable called speed, and that is going to be a float of 3 or whatever you want that to be set to. That depends on how fast you want it to move around the screen. We're going to create a new graph in just a second. Let's do one more thing. Let's go ahead and add our input system, player input, right there. Let's go ahead and add that, and we will make changes to that as we go along. The next thing I would recommend that you do, just for organizational purposes, is going to your assets folder. Go ahead and create 4 new folders. So this one I'm just going to name changes. And inside of that, I'm going to create 4 new folders. The first one is going to be called input system. Second one is going to be called macros. Third one is going to be called prefabs. And the last one is going to be called scripts. And this is just the changes that we're going to be making in this build. And I'm doing this so that I don't mess with any of the stuff that they have. We want to use our own stuff. So that's why I've set those folders up. Highly recommend being organized as you can. And we're going to need to make a couple of changes to the animator on the player. And he actually already has this set up. And let me just basically show you the way he has this. If I can get the screen to come up. There we go. All right, so he actually has 2 layers under his animator. So he has one for movement. So basically, whenever you play, if you look at the little cat thing that he's got there, it just kind of bobs up and down like it's idle. And when it's moving, it bobs up and down faster and faster and faster. And so basically, he has one of these layers set for movement and the other set for direction. That's going to determine which direction he's facing. And what we're going to do is we're going to delete all of that. We don't need any of that. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a blend tree. And the blend tree is going to take care of all the directions for us. So let's just call this direction. And if I can spell direction. There we go. And from our any state, we are going to make a transition to direction. And for the transition, if you click on the little arrow, the condition is going to be is moving is true. And if that's the case, then it should go to a specific direction. Now, for our parameters, we do not need this blend. We are going to have to add 2 more float variables. So if clicking parameters, go up to the little arrow here, or the little plus sign, and hit float, and we're going to call one horizontal, and the other one is going to be vertical. Now, opening up our blend tree, you should have something that looks just like this. That's all that's in there. We are going to have to change the blend type to a 2D simple directional. And then what we're going to use is horizontal for one axis and vertical for the other. And then we are going to begin adding motion fields. Now, what we're doing here is we are adding back in the animations that he had already had set up. Now, I'm starting with south and not north. If you want to know why, it is because that is going to be the default state whenever it's setting at 0. So when you start the game, I just want him facing me, and so I'm using south instead of north. So north, south, east, west is typically what I would do. But through building this 3 or 4 times, that's just kind of the way I've learned that it's the best way to do that. So what we're going to do is go to south, north, east, and west, and we're going to have to set this up on the X position for the blend tree to work properly. Now, on a south, the X is going to be 0, the Y is going to be a -1. For the north, it is going to be a +1 on the Y, 0 on the X. For east, let me think. East is going to be a 1 on the X and 0 on the Y, and then a west is going to be a -1 on the X-axis and a 0 there. So what this is doing is it's saying whichever one of these parameters, horizontal and vertical, are set to a specific, if you look down here on the screen, you should see those moving. And you should also notice that these circles are getting bigger. What it's doing is it's saying wherever the where it is X or Y axis, is going to jump to one of those animations. So that's basically the way a blend tree works, which is really cool. Okay, the next thing we're actually going to need to do is going to our main camera here. We are going to have to take off this audio listener. We are not going to be using any kind of add-on to be doing our camera follow. He actually has a pretty cool little script. It's very, very simple. Just it's targeting the player here. So if it's not saying player, you can just drag your player in. And for the player, if you actually go back down and look at the player input, it's going to want a camera. And so what you can do is drag in that main camera. Now, there is one little hack that we're going to have to do here just to ensure that everything works whenever we start going split screen for multiplayer. Just go ahead and create a new empty object, and let's call this player parent. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure the transform is set to 0 on the player, the main camera, and the player parent. And the reason we're doing that is because we don't want any funny business whenever we start adding players. So our player and our main camera are going to need to set underneath that player parent. And if you don't like where the camera is setting, which I actually don't, I'm just going to set the Y position to 1. And that kind of centers the top of its head with the center of the screen. But this is actually going to be the prefab that we're going to be spawning. So when we start instantiating our game objects, go ahead and grab that and drag that into your prefabs folder, and it will create a prefab for you. And that is, like I said, what we're going to instantiate in. It's going to be a camera and a player all together. Okay, the next thing we're going to need to do is set up an input action. So going into my input system folder here, I'm going to right click and go to create, and scrolling all the way down to the bottom where it says input actions, I'm just going to call this, let's say, player input. And when you double click that and open it up, you should see a panel that looks just like this. This is going to be where our actions are actually going to be taking place. So whenever you push a button, this is what we want it to do. So what we're going to do is go over here to action maps, and we're going to hit a plus sign, and let's just call this action map player. And then for this new action, let's call it move. And this is not going to be a button. Let's set it to value. You really need to learn the difference between these three, and there's great videos that talk about the difference between those, but we're just going to use a value here, and the button or the control type is actually going to be a vector 2. And so you should see here when you hit this drop down, it should say binding. Now I actually have both of my Xbox controllers already plugged in, and so you might need to go ahead and do that, but you can actually look for the device that you're looking for. So you can go to a gamepad and hit left stick. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and go to listen here, and then I'm going to press a button that I want to be a move on my controller, and that is the left stick. So you should see here left stick gamepad and left stick Xbox controller. I'm going to go ahead and choose gamepad because they have a pretty robust system set up just with gamepad that I don't have a PS4 or whatever, the PS12 or whatever's out now. I'm old and outdated. I don't care. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and use this, and it should work for just about any gamepad that you have. So left stick gamepad is going to be the move action that we're going to use. And when you're done with that, go ahead and hit save asset. Now that we have that input action actually set up, we can now go to our player parent game object and open it up and go to the player game object underneath that. And now we can add our input action into this player input. So this is going to be what it's going to be listening for. Go ahead and hit player input. Now, this is where the C# script is really going to come in handy. So if you actually go to the behavior and hit invoke Unity events, what you should see is an event system. I don't know if you've ever used an event system, but underneath that you should see player. And we have that move callback context. This is what we need to access, and for the life of me, man, I tried and tried. I could not figure out a way to access this using visual scripting. They just haven't given me the ability, or maybe I'm just dumb. If you can figure this out, let me know if you can do this without a C# script. But this is what we're going to be accessing. So the time has come for our C# script. So go into the scripts folder and right click and hit create C# script, and let's just name this player input system, and go ahead and open that up. Okay, once that opens up, I don't know if you ever used C#. This is really not going to be bad at all, I promise. We are not going to need these top two namespaces. Those are not going to be used. So just go ahead and delete those. And then you're going to need to add the using Unity engine.input system namespace. So that makes it to where we can actually pull from the input system nodes. You're not going to need the start or the update here. All we are going to need is to create a public variable, and it's a vector2. So basically what this is doing is making it to where we can actually access this. If it's public, we can look at it from other objects. And so we're just creating a vector2, and we're naming it movement, and then we're going to create an onMove input action. If you go back to this and you go back to player, what we're going to be doing is we're going to create under our events an event right down here that is a callback action. So we're going to need a C# script that we're going to put there, and we're going to need the onMove function. So that's what we're going to make. So go ahead and make a public void onMove, and if you don't hit escape there, it's going to make onAnimatorMove input action dot callback context space, and we're just going to name that context. And what this is going to give us the ability to do is look at that context game object. And so what we're doing is anytime the onMove is triggered, we're going to perform what is being in these brackets. So what we're going to do is we're going to just set our movement equal to the context.read value, vector2, and we're going to need a couple of those brackets there and a semicolon. So basically what this is doing is it's just saying set the vector2 movement to whatever the joystick is doing, whatever the left thumbstick is doing. Read the value of that vector2 and set it to a public variable so that we can look at it and use it in other places. Okay, once you save and close that, we're going to need to go to our player game object, and we're going to need to grab and throw on this player input system. Let me go down here to the bottom. Just add this script to your player component, and then as we go into our event system down here under player input, go to player, and then drag in this player input system right there, and you should see it drop down whenever you go to player input system that you have that onMove function that we called. So anytime the joystick moves, it's going to do this callback context, and it's going to set whatever the joystick is to that movement vector2 variable that we have. We're also going to need to go ahead and throw in our script machine right here, and then we're going to want to do, let's see, a flow machine, and we're going to want to do trigger Unity event. And I'll show you exactly why we're doing this in just a second. Just name this onMove. Okay, one last thing we're going to need to do, because we didn't do it earlier, is we're going to need to create a C# script. So go ahead and hit new here, and let's put that inside changes, inside macros. We can actually even do another folder if you wanted and call it player. I don't know, OCD about being organized, and then name this player. And then we should have a visual scripting graph on that player game object now. If it will show up. Are we good? What's going on? There we go. Okay, so now we have a start update. You go ahead and delete both of those. You're not going to need those. Let's get started with our visual scripting graph. Back up. I missed one thing. Go to Edit, go to Project Settings, and under Visual Scripting, under your Project Settings, go to Type Options, and then scroll down. And we're actually going to have to add that C# script so that we can actually read it. So going here to Type, let's go to Player Input System. Is that what we called it? Yeah, Player Input System. And once you add that into that C# script, hit Regenerate Units. And what it's going to do is it's going to recompile the units that it actually can pull out of a graph. And so we are going to, because we set that public float variable to that vector2 variable, we're actually going to be able to access that as a node in our Unity visual scripting graph now. Okay, now that we have that set, we are going to go into our script graph, and the first thing that we're going to need to do is whenever we enable the player game object, we are going to need to create a variable that we are going to reference in an update function. So if we don't do this on enable, we are going to get errors. So let's go ahead and set up the on enable event, and let's set our graph variable, and let's call it is moving. And then we're going to set that to false. And again, this is going to be referenced in an update. Now you could go ahead and just add the graph variable right here, and you wouldn't have to have this little on enable event. But I just prefer to do it this way, just to make sure that it's always set on the instantiated game object. So right here, I don't know, I just use a color code system. If you ever seen me do visual scripting, you'll know what I'm talking about. Green means it's doing something, and yellow means a check, purple means something vanity, whatever. Anyway, you have to create your own system. So if you remember, we made a Unity event, and we made it, and I told you I was going to tell you what it was for, and we called it onMove. On our player game object right down here under our events, under player, we set up a flow macro or flow machine Unity event called onMove. That is where this is going. So whenever the joystick is moved, this is going to trigger. And when it triggers, what we need to do is we need to set, let's go ahead and just grab this right here. This is what we're going to set. Duplicate that, move it up. We're going to set this to true. So it is moving. So we're moving the joystick. Now we're moving that. We also have to set the animator bool. And this is so that set bool animator name value. We're going to set it capital I is moving, and we're going to set that to true. If you actually go to the player game object and you look under the animator, it wants to know this one right here. What we're doing is we're saying that is true, and so it's going to trigger those animations. So this is our let's call this set moving. And we will make that green because it's doing something. And then we, of course, are going to have to run this into a check. Is our movement still moving? Is our joystick being touched? Now, we're going to do that with a branch or an if statement here. We're going to run this into an equal. So we're going to check if the vector2 movement, so let's say get movement. You should see this player input system script that we created. So get that vector2, and let's see if it is equal to 0. If it is equal to 0, then what we need to do is we need to undo everything that we did right here. So let's take all of this, let's copy this or duplicate this, and let's move it right over here. So if it is true, we need to turn all this off because it's stopped moving. All right. So there's that. So we're going to call this stop movement or stop moving. Open this so you can kind of get a bigger picture of what we're working with here. All right, so this is going to be a check. So I'm going to make this yellow. This is going to be a stop. I just color code it so that if I have a problem in my code, I can easily look at a color and go to it. That's the only reason why I'm using colors. If it is not true, so let's say it is still moving, then what we need to do is we're going to run this into a sequence, and we need to set the float variables for our animator on our player game object. We need to set the horizontal and vertical to whatever the horizontal and vertical is on that axis. So what we're going to do is run this into a sequence. The sequence is going to go into a set float, set animator float name and value. The X is going to go into a horizontal, and the Y is going to go into the vertical. We want this to happen at the same time, so we're going to use this sequence. And we're going to need this to be the get X, vector 2 get X, and then this is going to be the get Y, vector 2 get Y. And we're going to just duplicate this. You could just drag it down if you want, but I like kind of being separate nodes here. All right, that's going to be there. This is going to be here. See if I can clean this up a little bit. And then right here, we're going to call this set direction. And because this is kind of an animator and it's all about vanity, I don't know. I just use purple for that. All right, so the next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to set the movement. So we've set it to where it's facing the direction, but we haven't actually put anything into the movement. So the way we're doing that is we're going to use an update node. So create an update node, and then we're going to run that into a branch or an if statement. And the branch is going to check and see that graph variable. So it's going to get the graph variable, and it should have is moving here. So is moving true. Is moving true. And if it is, so we're going to say is moving. Set that to a yellow because it's a check. And if it is moving, if that is true, well, then we need to put it into the movement. So if moving is true, let's go ahead and set the velocity on a rigid body 2D, because it's a 2D game and we have a 2D rigid body on this. And what the rigid body, the velocity that we want to set on that is our movement. So let's do multiply here. Our movement times our speed. So speed is our object variable that we set up on our player earlier. Should be right, where's it at? Right there. It's a float of 3. We're going to set that. We're going to multiply it times our get movement, which is in that player input system macro, that C# script that we made. And if it is not moving, then what we need to do is we need to set the velocity to 0. So that's just going to go to set 0. So this is going to be our actual set velocity or / movement, whatever you want to call movement. Okay, let's try that again. Movement. There we go. And so that is going to be setting our movement. Cool. So that is our graph completed. Very nice. Okay, the last thing we're going to need to do is set up our multiplayer so that whenever we add more controllers, we will get more players. What we're going to do that is go to our hierarchy and create an empty game object, and let's call this player input manager. And in order to do multiplayer with the Unity input system, we're going to need the player input manager node right here. Let's kind of move this over a little bit so we can see what we're working with. We're going to change the join behavior. We're not going to do join when button is pressed, just because I don't want the mouse or the keyboard to come in. I want an actual button from the gamepad to set it. So I'm going to set this to join players when action is triggered, and you can have a reference here that if you do that, you can, if you already had one set up. I'm just going to create a new action, and we're just going to say let's create a binding. And under that binding, if you double click it and you scroll right down here and hit listen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the start button on my Xbox controller, and it's going to, the menu button on the Xbox controller. It's a start on a gamepad. It's pretty much the same button on all the gamepads there, and that is going to be our binding for that. So whenever you hit start on your gamepad, that's what's going to allow you to join as a new player. Now, before we set up our player prefab there, let's just talk about these other two things. You can limit the number of players to 2 if you like. I only have 2 controllers, so I'm not going to do that. And I'm also going to have enable split screen here. And I'm not going to check the maintain aspect ratio or set the fixed number. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm gonna limit the number of players to 2. I'm not gonna hit the set fixed number on the number of screens, because it's going to keep it split if you set that. So I'm not going to set fixed number. I am going to set the max player count to 2 or whatever, 4, whatever you have. Okay, so now that we have that set up, we're going to need to drag in our player parent, but I'm not going to do it from here because I'm about to get rid of this. So before I do anything else, I'm just going to go and I'm going to apply all of the changes to that player parent prefab. And from our player input manager, I'm going to go to our let's see, our prefabs folder where our player parent is setting, and I'm going to drag that in to our player prefab. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this from the scene. That's not going to be in our scene anymore. And so whenever we hit the start button, hopefully you should see now, if you have multiple controllers set up, that whenever you start the game, of course there's no cameras that are rendered until you hit start, and now you have a little guy that will move around. And so when you hit start on the other controller, you should notice that he can move around as well, and it's very, very difficult to do 2 different things at once. But as you can see, the buttons are independent of each other, and you have one game object that can move around and do whatever you want it to do, and a second one. Now, just for bonus content, you may be wondering, how do you get different colors on your game objects? You can have a whole screen. I'm not really going to go into all of that, but I will show you how I just very quickly set up some different colors on my game object. So double clicking that player parent game object, I just went under player here, and it opens up this flow macro. And what I did is I created a new scene variable, and let's just call it player colors. And I'm going to set this as a list of colors. List of color, and then I'm just adding 2 colors in because I only have 2 players. Let's do kind of like a light green on one, and let's do like a medium red on the other. And so what we're going to do is when we enable the game object, it's going to pick from that list of colors. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a sprite renderer set color right here, and I'm going to set this game object to the first object in the list. So let's do get list item, just like that, and our list is going to be our player colors. So it's going to get index 0, which is the first object in the list, and it's going to set the sprite render color to that. So whatever the cat picture is, it's going to set that to that color. And then what I need to do is I need to remove that list item. Remove list item. And I need to take it from the player colors list, and I'm going to take the first item off of that. And then after I press start, you should notice that, let's see, set color player, that when you do that, it should take one off the list, and then the green is taken. So I'll change that to purple, and we will exit out of that prefab. And now when we hit start, it should work. I don't think there's anything else that needs to happen. Let's see. So okay, we have a green player, and now we have a red player. Perfect. Also, as some bonus content, you may be wondering, okay, yeah, I've got the move. How do I set up like an attack or a jump or an action button? Well, that is actually very simple to do. Going back into our input system, you just go to the player input and you create a new action. What do you want it to do? So let's say, let's complete action button. So the action is going to be called action. It's going to be a button, and let's say I want it to be the A button on, or the set button south on the gamepad. That's going to be my action now. So I'll just save that. And you should notice that under your player game object, if you scroll down to the player input, you should see a new action. So go ahead and add a callback there and just drag in your script machine. And let's do a flow machine trigger unity event. And just very simple, let's call that, duplicate it. We will call that event, by the way. Let's just call that action. Alright, so this unity event will be called action. And whenever this is triggered, then we will say, let's just do a debug log. You can put whatever you want here. what do you want it to do? You're the master of that. So do string and action. It's what's going to show up in the debug log. So whenever we press play, we should see that it shows action, which right down there you see that taking place. Cool. And last but not least, you may be wondering, whenever you spawn your player in, what if you don't want it to spawn in the same place as it does on default? Well, the way that you can easily do that is by creating another empty game object and just say spawn location. I'm going to give that a gizmo so that I can see where that is located, and turn on my gizmo. There we go. And you should see that spawn location now has a little tab there, and let's see, I'm going to put them right down here. That is going to be our new location. Make sure the Z is set to 0. You don't want it to be set behind anything that it's not supposed to be set on. And now when we go to our player, let's see, player input manager, go to our player parent prefab, and you open that up, you should see that as you go into your player, you can create a scene. You know what, before we do that, let's go to, all right. How am I going to access that? Let's see. I think you have to drag in the player prefab real quick. And then now that you have your player prefab, go to your player. There we go. Okay, so now you can get the scene. And let's spawn location is going to be our scene variable. And let's make it a game object. And just drag in that spawn location right there. So that whenever you also on enable event, so on enable, let's say I'm going to set the position. Let's transform position. Set position, right? Where's that at? Transform set position. There we go. So I'm going to set the position, not of this game object, but of the parent game object. So get the parent, which is the player parent. We're going to set the position of that parent game object to the get location. Get transform. How do you do that? Get position, right? Get position. There you go. Get position of this game object on enable. And now, whenever we start the game, you should notice that when you press start, it will happen right down there. So I think it actually triggered without me hitting the button. Let me just check that real quick. Oh, it is because the player is already in the scene. So you're going to have to delete that out. So before we delete that out, let's go ahead and hit override. Okay, there's no changes to be made. Just delete that. And now when we hit play and I hit start, it should spawn in that location. Awesome. Excellent. So we're good to go. Nice. Okay, so that is the completed build. I really, really like the Kainos Pixel Art top-down pack. It's a really cool asset, and maybe now you can have some fun pushing some blocks around the level with a friend. In closing, I'd just like to say that if you're ever frustrated that there is very little tutorial content on Unity visual scripting, I seriously feel your pain. That's kind of why I felt motivated to make this tutorial, and if you share my frustration for a lack of tutorial content on Unity visual scripting, maybe you'd be willing to help support me or maybe somebody else that's making content on Patreon so that we can keep making tutorial videos like this one. This project took me several days to figure out and a lot of research on how the Unity input system works so that I could bring it to you. So yeah, any support you could help me out with would be most appreciated. There is a Patreon link in the description below. Anyway, go have some fun making a great game. Just for now, let me say thank you for joining me. My name is Megahertz, and I'm out.